Good evening, everybody. Tonight the TcdTheo is very pleased to have with us Father Peter McVerry. Father McVerry has been involved in the Dublin homeless scene for more than 30 years now. He's working with young homeless people and campaigning for their rights. In 1979 he set up a hostel for young homeless people, and 4 years later founded the great foundation, later renamed the Peter McVerry Trust. Peter is also a writer. He's written about his memoirs or his writings from his experiences, and he's written on Jesus as a social critic, making him what I'd call a living liberation theologian practicing in Ireland. We're very happy to have him here tonight. Would you please welcome Father Peter McVerry.
Well, thank you very much, Mick, and good evening, everybody. What I'd like to talk about is just a little bit about my experience of working with homeless people, and to talk about how they have changed me, because they have totally and radically changed me. They have turned me inside out and upside down. They have challenged my values. They have revealed to me some of my prejudices. They have changed my understanding of God. They have changed my relationship with God. They have totally changed me, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. And then I'm not going to talk really about homeless policy unless you want to bring that up at the discussion stage. I think the present homeless policy is excellent. Implementation is a disaster. But we could, if you want to talk about that later. And maybe some reflections then around theology and around my understanding of who God is from my work with working with them. I began working with homeless young people quite by accident. In 1974, I went to live and work in the inner city with two other Jesuit priests. Why did we move in? We moved in because the faith, the justice dimension of the Christian faith had become a very significant dimension, particularly in Latin America. And it was transferring over to Europe very slowly and very sheepishly, but it was transferring over. And so the Jesuits decided back then in the early 70s that we ought to explore this justice dimension. And so we looked for a flat to live and work in a deprived area. We went to Dublin City Council and they gave us a flat in Summerhill in the north inner city. So 3 of us moved in there. Luckily, on the day we moved in, it wasn't raining. We moved into a top floor flat. I better describe the houses there in the north inner city. There was about 40 terraced houses. Each house 4 stories high, and on each floor you had a moderately sized room. And originally each one of these houses was owned by a wealthy family. So they lived in one of these 8-roomed houses. Then when the inner city began to run down, the wealthy families moved out to the suburbs, and Dublin City Council bought the houses, and they made each room into a flat for a family. So in each one of these houses there were 8 families. As I say, we got the top floor flat. When it rained, the rain just came through the ceiling. In our flat it wasn't too bad. It all sort of came together and dripped down the light bulb. But families on the top floor would tell you of a whole bedroom being unusable. The rain just came through the ceiling. The place was crawling with rats. And the rats were the size of little kittens. And they were immune from every poison that had ever been invented. So again, on the top floor, we'd be lying in bed at night. You'd have the ceiling 8 feet above your head. All night long, you listen to the rats running along the ceiling. They'd be fighting with one another, squealing, dragging things. Occasionally they'd eat through the electric wires and all the lights would go out. And again, it wasn't too bad on the top floor, but families on the ground floor and on the first floor would tell you of waking up in the morning and finding a rat on the baby's cot. So it was pretty miserable. But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst of it was there was no soundproofing between flats, because they were originally just rooms in a house. And so we could hear the news on the television in the flat below perfectly clearly. We didn't need to turn our own on. And so that was bad enough. But Summerhill and Sean McDermott Street, two parallel streets, were used by Dublin City Council as a dumping ground for families with problems. And usually the problems were alcohol related. And so some of the families, there were many very fine families living there, but some of the families had serious alcohol problems, and they had been evicted from other parts of the city, either for not paying their rent because all the money went on drink, or because their kids were running wild and they were too drunk to control them, and they would be rehoused in Summerhill. Which meant that in each one of these houses you had at least one problem family, or rather I prefer to say one family with problems. And the family with problems in our house lived in the flat just underneath us. And there you had a husband and a wife, both alcoholics, and a 3-year-old son. Parents would be out in the pub every night, come back at 1 o'clock in the morning, drunk. And about 3 times a week, you could nearly set your alarm by them, they would have an almighty row. And they'd be fighting and shouting and screaming at one another and throwing things at one another. Cups would be flying across the room and smashing against the wall. And this might go on for 2 hours until they fell asleep from drinking from exhaustion. But the rest of the house was wide awake. You didn't sleep through this. And so, if you can imagine what it was like for parents who had to get up in the morning to go to work, maybe 2 or 3 nights a week, they were awake most of the night. They might sleep it out in the morning and go into work late. Or, if they got into work in time, they were tired. And their productivity wasn't up to the same level as everybody else. And eventually the employer says, better get rid of this guy. Can't come in time, can't do a decent day's work. So living in those conditions, very difficult to hold down a job. And you can imagine what it was like trying to go to school. Again, you were awake half the night. You maybe sleep it out in the morning. You go into school tired. You sit at the back of the class falling asleep. You fall behind the rest of the class. You don't understand what the teacher is teaching you. You become therefore bored. And when you're bored, you become difficult. And you either get expelled or you just walk out. And so when we were there in the 1970s, no young person in that area had gone to school beyond the age of 12. They were all walking out. And so there you had a whole pile of young people hanging around the streets all day long, most of their parents unemployed, couldn't give them any money. So what were they doing? They were doing a bit of robbing to make a few bob, and by 16 or 17 they were ending up in prison. And it was as predictable as day follows night. And the circumstances in which people lived there shocked me. They shocked me because I'd been living in Dublin for many years before that, and I had no idea that people lived in those circumstances in Dublin, the capital city. And what shocked me even more, what shocked me even more than the circumstances in which they were living, was the fact that I had been totally unaware of those circumstances. And so we decided, right, that we'd better start working with young people. That was a priority. And we opened services for young people. We opened a youth club and a craft centre, and we had some employment schemes going. We took them away at weekends, what you usually would do with young people. And it was as a result of that we became aware of one young person who would be leaving us at 11 or half 11 at night, and they were going off to find somewhere to sleep. And that kid was 9 years of age, sleeping on the streets. So we decided, gosh, we better do something for kids who are out in the street. And so we opened a small hostel for 6 boys, because it was all boys then, there were no girls on the streets back then. We opened a hostel for 6 boys up to the age of 16 who were sleeping on the streets. And I ran that for a few years. Then they were leaving that at 16, 16 and a half, because they were growing out of it. And they were going back onto the streets, because there was nowhere else for them to go. So we said we'd better open a hostel for the over 16s. So we opened a hostel for the over 16s. They had demolished the whole inner city at that stage. So I had moved to Ballymun along with the other Jesuits I was living with. And so we asked Dublin Corporation, Dublin City Council back in Ballymun to give us a flat to use as a hostel for the over 16s. And to my surprise, and to their regret ever since, they gave it to me. And so we had a flat, 3-bedroom flat, and the number of young homeless people is growing and growing and growing. Very often we had 15 young people living in a 3-bedroom flat. One particular night we had 19 there. And so we got another house to use as a hostel. And then we had to open a hostel for the over 18s. Then the drug problem hit Dublin. And so many of the young people coming to us were on heroin. And so we opened our own drug detox centre. Then the problem was, where do homeless people go when they've detoxed? Back onto the streets, in which case they've wasted their time. So we opened a drug-free aftercare house, where they could go and live for 6 months after becoming drug-free. And then the problem was, where do they go after the 6 months? So we started getting a few apartments together, and they could go and live in one of the apartments for another 12 months with support from our staff. And so the whole thing grew organically. Nothing was planned. We simply saw a need, we tried to meet that need, and then that opened up another need. You tried to meet that need, and it opened up another need. So from that 9-year-old kid who was sleeping on the streets, we now run 10 hostels, 3 of them for under 18s, 7 for over 18s. We have 3 drug treatment centres. We have about 70 apartments. We have a drop-in centre and a few other bits and pieces. So that's how our organisation started and how it developed. Who are homeless young people? We all have an image of homeless people, and that image tends to be a very negative image. And we generally see homeless people as people with a drug problem, people who might rob you, people you'd want to keep at a distance, people you wouldn't want to get too close to. And some homeless people are like that. But many homeless people are not. And we have had many homeless people go on to lead very successful lives. We have had homeless young people who have gone on to 3rd level education. We've had one homeless young person a couple of years ago began his PhD in computer science. Others went on and became carpenters or electricians or bricklayers. Some have done very well for themselves. One during the Celtic Tiger years had his own little construction company. He employed 10 or 12 people, and they were building small houses and extensions and renovations. But they would tend to be the homeless people who were least damaged by their childhood experiences. For example, the young fellow who ended up with his own little construction company, he grew up with his mother. His parents were separated. He grew up with his mother and his brothers and sisters. And when he was 15, his mother said, "I'm going to England." And he said, "You can go on your own. I'm staying here. My school is here, my friends are here. There's no way I'm going to England." So off you go. So off she went. And she gave the house back to the local authority, and here he was, 15 years of age, and he was on the streets with nowhere to live. He came and lived in our hostel for 3 or 4 years, moved on very successfully in life. However, at the other end of the spectrum, many homeless people have had disaster childhoods and have had experiences that no children should ever have to experience. Thinking of a young man, he was 12 years of age. His mother was a drug user, and every morning before he went to school, he had to go into town, buy the heroin his mother needed for the day, and he had to come back and help her to inject it. because she couldn't find a vein. So not surprisingly, by 15 he was injecting heroin and he was homeless. Another young lad, 14 years of age, every time he went home, his mother slammed the door in his face and said, "Go away, you're not wanted here." How do you cope with that at 14 years of age? He came, he lived with us for a few years, then he went to London, died in London from a drug overdose. They rang me and said, "Will you go out and tell his parents?" So I went out, I knocked on the door, his mother answered the door, and I said, "I'm here about your son." And she said, "Go away, I don't want to know." So growing up in a home where you're not wanted. Or a young fella knocked on my door late at night, 11 years of age, and he was very stoned. And he said, "Can I stay?" And I said, "No, you can't stay, you're only 11, I said. And anyway, you have a home to go to." Because I knew the fellow. He said, "I can't go home." "Why can't you go home?" I said. "Just can't go home." So I talked to him for a while, persuaded him to go home, put him into my car, drove him up to his house. "There you are now, in you go." "Can't go in." "Why can't you go in?" I said. "Just can't go in." Talked to him for another little bit. He was being sent out every night into prostitution, and he had to come back with a certain amount of money every night, otherwise he'd get a beating. So young people who have had horrific childhoods. Some of them take drugs. Why do they take drugs? They take drugs for a very different reason why other young people of their age might take drugs. Young people today might take drugs out of curiosity, see what they're like. Or they might take drugs out of peer pressure. You know, you're out with all your mates for the night and everybody's smoking a joint or taking a line of cocaine or whatever, and they say, "Do you want some?" And you don't want to be the odd one left out. So you go along with them. But these young people take drugs to forget their childhood memories and to suppress the feelings that are associated with those memories. And drugs work. So one young man said, "Would you not think of giving up heroin?" And he said, "When I stop taking heroin, I feel the pain too much." A young fellow who had been abused as a child. A young girl said it very poetically shortly before she died of a drug overdose. She said, "Wouldn't it be wonderful if you could run so fast that your memories couldn't catch up?" So they're using drugs to run away from their memories. So what happens when they come off drugs? When they come off drugs, all those memories and the feelings associated with them, they all come flooding back to the surface, and they come back with a vengeance. And you'd better be able to cope. We had one guy came down to our detox centre, came off drugs, came back to Dublin, was doing very well until his granny died. Went to the funeral of his granny. There in the front row of the mourners was the uncle who had abused him as a child. All the memories and feelings came flooding back. And in the middle of that funeral service, he got up out of the bench and he literally ran down the centre aisle of the church and out the door, and the next day he killed himself. So for them, coming off drugs is hugely difficult, hugely traumatic, and they require all the support, the counselling and the therapy that we can give them. So it's not a question of why don't they stop taking drugs. It's not nearly as simple as that, if only it were. So they're the young homeless people that we're working with. What have they done for me? As I say, they have done